So when I think about the way that the proposed charter is operating, and in a way it has done its work, right? Its ideological work, its political work is being done now as the discussion is transpiring, as people are choosing sides, right, and finding their toeholes of argumentation, those doing it for as well as those doing it against, and I do see that it's in this way it's functioning more as one of those soft tactics of power rather than the more extreme authoritarian version of how power can be exercised. And it makes me think quite a bit of the kind of writing that Etienne Balibar has done. He wrote some very, very good work in the 1980s on what he called neo-racism. And what's interesting, he said, about the contemporary state of racism is that it's not the racism of the 19th century, right? It's not Gobineau, it's not blood, right? It's a different language of racism. And in fact, what he said is that today you find that it becomes the cultural, right? It becomes the ethnicized. It becomes forms of expression that are oriented and organized as though they operate as though they're a kind of nature, right? They operate to present a legible, at least to other people, a legible sense of self, a legible sense of character, a legible sense of essential being. And in fact, he calls this, it's a form of racism without race, right? And I think that this is partly what is going on with this. I think that the proposed charter is one example of the enacting of this particular kind of neo-racism, which often, as Balibar writes, takes place in around discussions of immigration.
But the deepest thing about the Charter is this notion of exclusion, and us and them, right? So we have to ask, who are the us? And why is this thing coming up at this particular moment in time? Why now? Why not before? Bearing in mind that the Charter is just the latest installment of a debate that has been raging here, and that was actually, that escalated into a moral panic, which was then dealt with by the state through the commissioning of a commission, basically, a blue ribbon panel, the Bouchard-Taylor Commission, and it's then province-wide hearings, which legitimized a tremendous amount of racism.
I think anytime we're hearing terminology like our values, our heritage, it's alarm bells that we should be very concerned about, because it really is an attempt to kind of draw a line in the sand between us, a supposed us, and a them. And that's why we should begin to pay closer attention. The Bouchard-Taylor Commission essentially was a political instrument. It was a bit of a cop-out by the premier at the time, Jean Charte, who, in response to this event that happened in Hérouville, which is about 160 kilometers outside of Montreal, had essentially announced publicly and posted on their municipal website a code of conduct for any immigrants that might be moving to Hérouville. And it was an incredibly xenophobic document, and it wasn't until it actually made international news. It was on the BBC, it was in a New Zealand newspaper as well, but also in Libération in France, that I think most cogently took a position and kind of questioned the framing of the code of conduct that had been stating essentially what the kind of guidelines and behavior that potential immigrants might have. And I mean, it didn't address any issues that would have had any practical pertinence to the ways that people were already living in Hérouville at the time. So I think by by basically commissioning Bouchard and Taylor to undertake a kind of town hall approach where they crisscrossed the province for about 3 months. Essentially what it created in the media was a hateful, racist discourse in the public sphere that got reported as is in the media. And I think that was the most painful and damaging and violent part of the commission itself. I mean, it took them ages to actually produce, I think it was a 350-page document in the end, but I think Yasmin Jawani and I have looked at the impact itself of creating an event like that in the process, in the province, on a day-to-day kind of basis, because essentially what it did was it sanctioned a racist discourse to circulate in the public sphere repeatedly, and I think even more insidiously, it allowed for a range of type of anxieties that were not only racist but xenophobic, also sexist, to kind of congeal together and be conflated, so that you had issues like kosher food, tax-free cigarettes on native reserves, and the wearing of the hijab to all suddenly be intimately related and part of a conspiracy on the part of people of color and native people to kind of perpetrate and threaten, basically the so-called dominant values of Quebec culture.
One of the things that the Charter does, when I say that it legitimizes forms of violence, is discursive violence, symbolic violence, the very idea of what one can wear or not wear, all right? That's actually a violation of human rights. Violation coming from the violence done to the subject, right? So here, what's happening is that this is state-mandated violence. So it's a violence at the discursive level, it's a violence at the corporeal level in terms of who gets to do whatever they want and who doesn't. It's a violence in terms of the kind of corporeal insignia that's allowed or disallowed, right? But it's a violence that ultimately transcends the discursive realm and actually becomes manifest in the kinds of reactions that people have been leveling at women, primarily women who choose to wear the hijab. So there are stories about women being pushed off the bus. There are stories about women who have gone for coffee and have been told basically that they're not going to be served. And there is actually a group in Quebec, it's called, I think, the Collective Against Islamophobia, that has documented over 117 cases of Islamophobia, just since discussion of the Charter ensued, compared to only something like 25 or cases that had occurred in the months before, since the beginning of this year. So we're in 2013, it's now November. So the Charter sort of debate, what started in late August, early September, in that period of time, 117 incidents. That's just this one organization. So you can imagine how much, and this is recorded, for a person to actually go and say, all right, I've experienced racism, takes a lot. So what about the undocumented cases? What about the everyday racism, right? And the violence of that is undocumented, that is simply passed over, or that, is likely to be trivialized by other people in positions of power who would say, well, you shouldn't take this so seriously.
However, what's interesting about this is that it doesn't create just a divide between the us and them, but it also creates another divide between the them, in that it creates a good them and a bad them. And I used Mahmoud Mamdani's term, where he discusses the good Muslim and the bad Muslim. And I quote from his book entitled Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. Good Muslims are modern, secular, and westernized, but bad Muslims are doctrinal, anti-modern, and virulent. And so this is really relevant with the Charter that is promoting this idea of secularism and promoting this idea of gender equality, as though people part of the Jewish community, the Sikh community, and the Muslim community don't have gender equality already.